The old blue Honda pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Community Center at exactly 7 in the morning. Margaret Chen sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring at the building through her windshield. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. This was it. Her new beginning. At 52, Margaret had learned that life rarely goes according to plan. 6 months ago, she was living in the house where she and David had spent 27 years of marriage. Now David was gone, the house was sold, and she was starting over in a town where nobody knew her story. That's exactly how she wanted it. She grabbed her purse and the small lunch bag from the passenger seat. The morning air was crisp, and she could hear children's voices from the elementary school next door. The sound made her smile just a little. There was something hopeful about children's laughter, even on days when hope felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. The community center was bigger than it looked from the outside. Margaret pushed through the glass doors and found herself in a lobby filled with bulletin boards advertising yoga classes, art workshops, and music lessons. A woman with graying hair and kind eyes approached her from behind the reception desk. "You must be Margaret. I'm Linda, the center coordinator. Welcome to Riverside." Linda's handshake was warm and firm. She led Margaret down a hallway lined with photographs of community events. Margaret noticed several pictures of concerts and recitals, but she looked away quickly. "Your main responsibilities will be cleaning the classrooms, practice rooms, and common areas," Linda explained as they walked. "We have 3 music teachers who use the practice rooms pretty heavily, so those spaces need daily attention. The custodial closet is right here, and I'll show you where we keep all the supplies." Margaret nodded, taking mental notes. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. After David's medical bills and the funeral expenses, she needed steady income more than she needed pride. They passed a door marked Music Room A, and Margaret could hear someone playing piano inside. The melody was familiar, a simple batch invention that she recognized immediately. The student was making several mistakes, hitting wrong notes and rushing through the difficult passages. Margaret's fingers twitched involuntarily, muscle memory, wanting to correct the errors. She forced her hands to stay still. "That's one of our piano teachers working with a student," Linda said, noticing Margaret's glance toward the door. "Mrs. Rodriguez has been with us for 8 years. Wonderful woman, very dedicated to her students." They continued the tour, passing 2 more practice rooms and a larger space that Linda called the recital hall. Through the window, Margaret could see a beautiful black grand piano sitting center stage. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. She hadn't been this close to a concert grand in years. "We host fundraising events and student recitals in there," Linda continued. "It's one of our most popular spaces for community gatherings." Margaret simply nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The next few hours passed in a blur of learning routines and getting familiar with the building layout. Margaret started with the administrative offices, working quietly while staff members arrived for the day. She had always been good at making herself invisible when necessary, and today that skill served her well. By lunchtime, she had settled into a rhythm. The work was physical but not difficult, and the building was peaceful. She ate her sandwich in the small break room, listening to the distant sounds of lessons and activities throughout the center. That's when she first heard the conversation that would change everything. 3 women entered the break room, talking animatedly among themselves. Margaret recognized one as Mrs. Rodriguez, the piano teacher Linda had mentioned. The other 2 introduced themselves as Miss Kelly and Mrs. Thompson, the violin and voice instructors. "I still can't believe Rachel dropped out 3 weeks before." "The fundraiser," Mrs. Rodriguez was saying, her voice filled with frustration. "She was our only student advanced enough to handle a piece that would really impress the donors." "What about Tommy?" suggested Miss Kelly. "He's been working hard on that Mozart sonata." Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. "Tommy is sweet, but he's nowhere near ready for something that's sophisticated. The board specifically asked for something that would showcase the quality of our program. They want to see what their investment is producing." Margaret continued eating her sandwich, trying not to eavesdrop, but the conversation was impossible to ignore in the small room. What piece were you planning to have Rachel perform? Mrs. Thompson asked. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, Mrs. Rodriguez replied with a sigh. She'd been working on it for 8 months. It's exactly the kind of piece that gets people excited about supporting arts education. Complex, beautiful, impressive. But now, she trailed off, spreading her hands in a gesture of defeat. Margaret nearly choked on her sandwich. Chopin's Ballade No. 1. She knew that piece intimately. Had performed it countless times in her former life. The memory of playing it at Carnegie Hall when she was 28 flashed through her mind so vividly that she could almost feel the stage lights on her face. Could we find a recording and have someone pretend to play along? Miss Kelly suggested. Hopefully, absolutely not, Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. That would be dishonest, and if anyone discovered the deception, it would destroy our credibility completely. Margaret finished her lunch quickly and headed back to work, but the conversation stayed with her. As she cleaned the practice rooms that afternoon, she could hear various students struggling through their pieces. Some showed promise, others were clearly beginners, but none had the technical skill required for advanced repertoire. In music. Room A, she found sheet music scattered across the piano bench. As she organized the papers, she saw it, the first page of Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. The notes seemed to jump off the page, each one triggering memories of countless hours of practice, of performances that had once defined her identity. She set the music back down carefully and continued cleaning, but her mind was elsewhere. In her small apartment that evening, she found herself humming the opening theme of the ballade. Her fingers moved silently across her kitchen table as if it were a keyboard, playing through passages she hadn't thought about in years. The next morning, Margaret arrived at work to find the music teachers in heated discussion near the reception desk. The fundraiser is in 3 weeks, Mrs. Rodriguez was saying to Linda. We have to give the board something impressive, or they might cut our program funding. But none of our current students can handle anything at the level they're expecting. Linda looked genuinely concerned. Isn't there anything we can do? Maybe reach out to former students? I've tried. Everyone who was advanced enough has either moved away or has other commitments. Margaret pushed her cleaning cart past them, heading toward the practice rooms. She told herself it wasn't her problem. She was just the custodian. Her performing days were long behind her, buried along with all the dreams she'd given up when life demanded different choices. But as she worked that day, listening to the teachers' ongoing worry and watching their mounting stress, something stirred inside her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, the desire to help, to use the gifts she'd spent so long trying to forget. That evening, as Margaret sat in her small apartment eating dinner alone, she made a decision that surprised even herself. Tomorrow, she would do something she'd sworn she'd never do again. She would offer to help. Margaret's hands shook as she knocked on the music room door. Through the glass window, she could see Mrs. Rodriguez organizing sheet music at the piano. It was almost 5 in the evening, and most of the staff had already gone home. This felt like the right time to have a conversation that could change everything. Come in, Mrs. Rodriguez called out, looking up with surprise when she saw Margaret enter. Oh, hello, is everything all right? Do you need to clean in here? Margaret clutched her cleaning supplies cart handle tighter. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something else. I heard you and the other teachers discussing the fundraiser situation yesterday. Mrs. Rodriguez's expression shifted from surprise to embarrassment. Oh dear, I hope we weren't being too loud. We didn't mean to burden you with our problems. You weren't being loud at all, Margaret assured her quickly. It's just that, well, during my job interview, I mentioned that I have some piano experience. Basic stuff, nothing fancy. But I was wondering if maybe I could help somehow. The piano teacher's eyebrows rose slightly. Margaret could see her trying to process this unexpected offer. Mrs. Rodriguez had been teaching for 15 years, and she'd learned to manage her expectations when adults claimed to have some piano experience. Usually that meant they could pick out Happy Birthday with one finger. That's very kind of you to offer, Margaret, Mrs. Rodriguez said carefully. But the piece we were planning is quite challenging. It's not really something that someone with basic skills could manage. Margaret nodded, expecting this response. I understand. But maybe you could let me try? I mean, what's the worst that could happen? If I can't do it, you're no worse off than you are now. Mrs. Rodriguez set down her papers and really looked at Margaret for the first time. The custodian was in her 50s, dressed in simple work clothes, with gentle eyes and calloused hands from years of manual labor. She certainly didn't look like someone who could tackle advanced classical music. What kind of piano experience do you have exactly? Mrs. Rodriguez asked, her tone gentle but probing. Margaret had rehearsed this answer. I took lessons as a child and teenager. Played in some recitals. Nothing professional, but I was fairly decent back then. It's been many years, though. I'm probably quite rusty. This was technically true, even if it was the understatement of the century. Margaret had indeed taken lessons as a child. She just didn't mention that those lessons had led to a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. Mrs. Rodriguez walked over to the piano and pulled out the sheet music for Chopin's Ballade No. 1. This is the piece we were planning. Take a look and tell me honestly what you think. Margaret approached the piano bench and looked down at the music. Her heart raced as she saw the familiar notation, but she kept her expression neutral. To Mrs. Rodriguez, she probably looked like someone trying to decipher a foreign language. It does look complicated, Margaret said truthfully. But I'd like to try if you'll let me. I understand if you think it's a waste of time. Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. The fundraiser was in 3 weeks. The board was expecting something impressive. They had absolutely no other options. What did they have to lose? All right, she said finally. But I need to be completely honest with you. This piece typically takes advanced students months or even years to master. The technical requirements alone are substantial, and that's before we even consider the musical interpretation. I understand, Margaret replied. If we're going to try this, we'll need to start immediately. Could you stay after work tomorrow for a practice session? I'd like to hear you play through some simpler pieces first, just to get a sense of your current skill level. Margaret's pulse quickened. Tomorrow, she would sit at a piano and play for someone else for the first time in over 20 years. The thought terrified and excited her in equal measure. That would be fine, she managed to say. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled, though Margaret could see the doubt in her eyes. I have to warn you, if this doesn't work out, we might need to find an alternative. Approach quickly. The board is putting a lot of pressure on us to deliver something special. After Margaret left, Mrs. Rodriguez immediately called Miss Kelly and Mrs. Thompson to share the bizarre development. The 3 teachers met in the break room the next morning to discuss the situation. She actually volunteered? Miss Kelly asked. In disbelief. The custodian wants to perform Chopin at the fundraiser? I know how it sounds, Mrs. Rodriguez said, stirring her coffee. But honestly, what choice do we have? We're desperate, Mrs. Thompson leaned forward. What if she's terrible? What if she can barely play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? We'll have wasted precious time we could have spent looking for other solutions? Then we'll know by tomorrow evening and we'll move on to Plan B, Mrs. Rodriguez replied. Though I have to admit, I'm not sure what Plan B is at this point. We could always do an instrumental ensemble piece, Miss Kelly suggested. Get several of our intermediate students to play together. It might not be as impressive as a solo piano performance, but it would be respectable. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded. Let's keep that as our backup plan. But first, let's see what Margaret can do. Word of the unusual arrangement began to spread through the community center staff. Linda, the coordinator, was intrigued when Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned it during their weekly check-in meeting. Margaret plays piano? Linda asked. She never mentioned that beyond the basic information on her application. She says she has some experience from when she was younger, Mrs. Rodriguez explained. I'm meeting with her after hours today to assess her abilities. Linda smiled. Well, you never know. People can be full of surprises. Meanwhile, Margaret went about her workday with unusual nervous energy. She found herself humming the opening theme of the Chopin Ballade as she cleaned. her mind automatically working through the fingering for difficult passages. Every time she passed the music room, her heart rate increased slightly. During her lunch break, she sat in her car and tried to calm her nerves. It had been so long since she'd played for anyone. What if her hands had forgotten how to move across the keys? What if 20 years of disuse had destroyed the technical skills she'd once taken for granted? But even as these doubts plagued her, another part of her mind was already planning her approach to the piece. She remembered exactly how she used to handle the challenging runs in the development section, the way she shaped the lyrical passages to bring out their emotional depth. The music was still there, waiting inside her like a sleeping giant dot as the afternoon wore on. Margaret noticed that Mrs. Rodriguez seemed increasingly anxious. The piano teacher kept checking her watch and shuffling through sheet music, clearly nervous about the evening's experiment. At 5 o'clock, Margaret finished her cleaning duties and made her way to the music room. Mrs. Rodriguez was already there, having arranged several pieces of music on the piano, some intermediate-level pieces, a few advanced studies, and finally the Chopin Ballade. "Ready?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked. Though her tone suggested she was anything but ready herself, Margaret approached the piano bench, her hands trembling slightly. "As ready as I'll ever be." What happened next would change both of their lives forever. Margaret sat down at the piano bench and adjusted her position carefully. The familiar weight of the keys beneath her fingertips sent a shock of recognition through her entire body. It had been so long, yet everything felt exactly the same. Mrs. Rodriguez stood beside the piano, holding a simple Mozart piece in her hands. "Let's start with something basic," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. "This is a sonatina that most of my intermediate students can handle. Just play through it as best you can, and don't worry about mistakes." Margaret looked at the sheet music and nodded. The piece was indeed simple, something she could have played perfectly when she was 12 years old. But she needed to be careful here. If she played it too well, Mrs. Rodriguez might become suspicious. If she played it poorly, the teacher would give up on her immediately. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The first few measures came out tentatively, with a slight hesitation that suggested someone who was genuinely rusty. Margaret deliberately added a small stumble in the fourth measure, the kind of mistake that someone returning to piano after many years might make. Mrs. Rodriguez listened intently, her expression gradually shifting from polite skepticism to genuine surprise. Even with the intentional imperfections, it was clear that Margaret understood the music. Her hand position was naturally correct, her rhythm was steady, and she had an instinctive sense of phrasing that couldn't be faked. "That was quite good," Mrs. Rodriguez said when Margaret finished. "Much better than I expected, actually. Your technique is rusty, as you said, but the foundation is definitely there." Margaret felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. She was deceiving this kind woman, but she told herself it was for a good cause. "Thank you." It felt good to play again, even something simple like that. "Let's try something a bit more challenging," Mrs. Rodriguez said, placing a Chopin waltz on the music stand. "This is what I'd consider early advanced level. Don't feel bad if it's too difficult." This time, Margaret allowed herself to play with a bit more confidence. The waltz was beautiful, and it was hard to resist the urge to bring out all its elegant nuances. She played it well, but not perfectly, making sure to include a few technical slips that would suggest someone working at the edge of their abilities. Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment after Margaret finished. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of excitement. "Margaret, I have to ask you something directly. Are you being completely honest about your background? Because what I'm hearing suggests more than just childhood lessons." Margaret's heart pounded. She had to make a choice right now about how much truth to reveal. "I was quite serious about piano when I was younger," she said carefully. "More serious than most kids, I suppose. I even considered studying music in college, but life took me in a different direction." This was true, technically. She had considered studying music in college. She just didn't mention that she'd actually done it. And then some. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "That makes more sense. You have good instincts and solid fundamentals. With some focused practice, you might actually be able to tackle something more substantial. She walked over to the piano and placed the Chopin Ballade on the music stand. I want you to look at this and tell me honestly what you think. Not whether you can play it perfectly, but whether you think you could work up to performing it in 3 weeks. Margaret stared down at the music she knew so intimately. Every note, every phrase, marking, every dynamic indication was burned into her memory. She had performed this piece at Lincoln Center when she was 31. The Review in the New York Times had called her interpretation transcendent. "It's very complex," she said, which was absolutely true. "But I'd like to try. Maybe I could work on just the opening section first." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at her watch. "We have time. Why don't you sight read through the first page, just to get a feel for it?" This was the moment Margaret had been both dreading and anticipating. She placed her hands on the keys and began the opening measures of the ballade. The music that emerged was careful, restrained, but undeniably beautiful. She played as if she were reading the notes for the first time, adding small hesitations and corrections that would be natural for someone encountering the piece initially, but even with her deliberate restraint, something magical was happening. The music seemed to come alive under her fingers. Mrs. Rodriguez found herself leaning closer to the piano, captivated by the sound. Margaret played through the first page, stopping where the music became more technically demanding. She lifted her hands from the keys and looked up at Mrs. Rodriguez with carefully controlled nervousness. "How was that?" Mrs. Rodriguez was staring at her with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Margaret, I need you to be completely honest. With me, that wasn't sight reading. That was someone who knows this music." Margaret felt her carefully constructed story beginning to crumble. "I may have heard it before. It's a famous piece." "Hearing it and playing it are two completely different things," Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. "What you just did requires serious training, professional level training." The room fell silent except for the sound of Margaret's rapid heartbeat. She looked down at her hands, still positioned over the piano keys, and made a decision that terrified her. "You're right," she said quietly. "I haven't been completely honest with you." Mrs. Rodriguez pulled up a chair and sat down beside the piano bench. "I'm listening." Margaret took a deep breath. The words that came next felt like they were being pulled from some deep, protected place inside her. "I was a professional pianist. A long time ago. I studied at music school and performed with orchestras. I had a career. I gave it up 25 years ago. My parents got sick, and I needed to take care of them. Then I met my husband, and he needed care too. I put the music away and focused on family. After David died last year, I decided I wanted a simple life. No complications, no pressure, no expectations." Mrs. Rodriguez sat in stunned silence, processing this revelation. "You were a professional concert pianist, and you're working as a custodian?" Margaret nodded. "It's honest work. And nobody expects anything from me except clean floors and empty trash cans." After years of being judged on every note I played, that kind of simplicity felt like freedom. "But you're offering to help us now. Why?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, trying to find the right words. "Because I heard how worried you were. Because this program matters to kids who love music the way I used to love it. And maybe because a part of me misses it more than I want to." "Admit." Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head in amazement. "I can't believe this. We have a professional pianist cleaning our building, and we never knew." "Former professional," Margaret corrected. "I haven't performed in 20 years. I'm not the same musician I used to be." "Would you play the opening again?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked. "But this time, don't hold back. Let me hear what you can really do." Margaret hesitated. Once she played this music the way she truly knew how, there would be no going back to her simple, anonymous life. But looking at Mrs. Rodriguez's hopeful face, she realized that maybe it was time to stop hiding. She placed her hands on the keys again, closed her eyes, and began to play the Chopin Ballade the way it was meant to be played. The way she had always known how to play it. The music that filled the room was nothing short of extraordinary. The sound that came from the piano was unlike anything Mrs. Rodriguez had ever heard in that practice room. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys with the kind of fluid grace that only comes from decades of training. The opening theme of the Chopin Ballade flowed like water, each note perfectly placed. Each phrase shaped with an understanding that went far beyond technical skill. Mrs. Rodriguez felt goosebumps rise on her arms. This wasn't just good playing. This was artistry at the highest level. When Margaret finished the section, the silence in the room felt heavy with emotion. "My God," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered. "Margaret, you're not just a former professional, you're a virtuoso." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she lifted them from the keys. "I was once. A long time ago. That level of playing doesn't just disappear," Mrs. Rodriguez said, still processing what she'd witnessed. "How long did you say it's been since you performed?" 20 years since my last public performance. I stopped practicing entirely about 15 years ago." Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head in amazement. "And you can still play like that?" "Margaret, do you understand what this means for our fundraiser? With your talent, we won't just meet expectations. We'll exceed them beyond anything the board could imagine." But Margaret looked uncertain. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of pressure. Playing for you, here, alone, is one thing. Performing in front of an audience is something completely different." "We have 3 weeks," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. "That's enough time for you to get comfortable with the piece again and prepare mentally for the performance." Margaret nodded slowly, but Mrs. Rodriguez could see the fear in her eyes. "Can we keep this between us for now? I need time to think." "About this, of course," Mrs. Rodriguez agreed. "But Margaret, I hope you'll seriously consider this. You have a gift that could really make a difference." Over the next few days, Margaret found herself in an odd position. During the day, she continued her custodial duties as usual, but after hours, she began returning to the music room to practice. She told herself she was just exploring whether she could really pull this off, but deep down, she knew she'd already made her decision. The first few practice sessions were emotional roller coasters. Her fingers remembered the music, but her stamina wasn't what it used to be. After just 30 minutes of playing, her hands would cramp and her back would ache from the piano bench. She was physically out of shape for the demands of serious piano playing, but gradually her body began to remember. The muscle memory that had been dormant for so long started to awaken. She found herself able to play for longer periods without discomfort. More importantly, the emotional connection to the music began to return. On the third evening of practice, something magical happened. Margaret was working through a particularly challenging passage in the middle section of the ballade when she suddenly forgot about everything else. The notes flowed from her fingers without conscious thought, and for a few precious minutes, she was 28 years old again, lost in the pure joy of making music. She didn't notice that someone was listening outside the door. Jake, the night security guard, had been making his rounds when he heard the piano music. At first, he assumed it was a recording, but as he listened more carefully, he realized someone was actually playing. The music was so beautiful that he found himself standing in the hallway, completely mesmerized. When Margaret finished practicing and left the building, Jake was waiting by the exit. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me asking, but was that you playing piano just now?" Margaret's face flushed. "Yes, I was practicing for a community event." Jake shook his head in wonder. "I've been working security here for 5 years, and I've never heard anything like that." "You play beautifully." "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. "I'm just helping out with the fundraiser." After Jake left, Margaret sat in her car for a long time, thinking about his words. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed the simple pleasure of someone appreciating her music. The next day brought an unexpected challenge. Mrs. Rodriguez approached Margaret during her lunch break with a request that made her stomach drop. "I know we agreed to keep this quiet, but I had to tell Miss Kelly and Mrs. Thompson about your background. They're my colleagues and they're involved in planning the fundraiser. They'd like to meet with you to discuss the details." Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "They just want to talk," Mrs. Rodriguez assured her. They're not going to pressure you, but they need to understand what we're working with so they can plan the rest of the program accordingly. The meeting took place after work in the main office, Miss Kelly, and Mrs. Thompson greeted Margaret with a mixture of curiosity and excitement that made her even more nervous. "Mrs. Rodriguez told us about your background," Miss Kelly said. "We're absolutely thrilled that you're willing to help us." "She also mentioned that you prefer to keep things low-key," Mrs. Thompson added. "We completely understand that." Margaret nodded, grateful for their sensitivity. "This is all very new for me. I haven't been in the music world for a very long time. Would you be comfortable if we arranged for you to have some private rehearsal time?" Miss Kelly asked. "We could make sure the building is empty during your practice sessions so you won't feel self-conscious." "That would be helpful," Margaret admitted. "I'm still getting reacquainted with the piece." Mrs. Thompson leaned forward. "We want you to know that we're not expecting perfection. Whatever you can give us will be wonderful. The fact that you're willing to try means everything." But Margaret could see the excitement in their eyes. They were expecting something special, and the pressure was starting to build. As she walked to her car that evening, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The following week brought a new routine. Margaret would finish her cleaning duties by 4:30, then return to the music room at 6 when the building was nearly empty. She had 2 hours of uninterrupted practice time before Jake arrived for his security shift. Slowly, the Chopin Ballade began to come back to life under her fingers. She worked through each section methodically, rebuilding the technical foundation while rediscovering the emotional landscape of the piece. Some passages came back easily, while others required patient repetition to restore their former polish, but something unexpected was happening during these practice sessions. Margaret was finding that her interpretation of the music had deepened over the years. The young woman who had first learned this piece had played it with technical brilliance and youthful passion. The mature woman who was relearning it brought something different to the music, an understanding of loss, resilience, and the bittersweet nature of life that made every phrase more meaningful. By the end of the week, Margaret knew she could perform the piece competently. The question was whether she had the courage to step onto a stage and share this music with an audience. Every time she thought about the fundraiser, her hands would shake slightly. On Friday evening, as she was packing up her things after practice, she found Mrs. Rodriguez waiting in the hallway. "How are you feeling about everything?" the teacher asked gently. Margaret sighed, terrified and excited in equal measure. "The music is coming back, but the thought of performing in public again is overwhelming. Would it help if we arranged a small preview performance? Just for the staff so you could get used to playing for people again?" Margaret considered this. "Maybe, as long as it's just a few people." "I'll arrange something for next week," Mrs. Rodriguez promised, something very low pressure. As Margaret drove home that night, she realized that somewhere during the past week, her life had begun to change in ways she hadn't expected. The simple, anonymous existence she'd built for herself was starting to crack open, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what might emerge. The night of the fundraiser arrived faster than Margaret had expected. She stood in the small backstage area of the community center's recital hall, wearing a simple black dress she'd bought especially for the occasion. Her hands were shaking, and she couldn't seem to catch her breath properly. Through the curtain, she could hear the audience filling the seats. The fundraiser had sold out completely, with over 200 people expected to attend. Board members, parents, local business owners, and community supporters had all come to see what the music program had to offer. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared beside her, looking almost as nervous as Margaret felt. "How are you holding up?" "I keep wondering what I've gotten myself into," Margaret admitted. "It's been so long since I've played for this many people." "Remember what happened at the staff preview last week?" Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. "You were incredible. Everyone was moved to tears." Margaret nodded, trying to draw strength from that memory. The small performance for the community center staff had gone well, but this felt completely different. Tonight, there were expectations. Tonight, people were depending on her to deliver something special. From the stage, she could hear Linda introducing the evening's program. Other students would perform first, giving Margaret time to calm her nerves. She listened as a young violinist played a Mozart piece followed by a children's choir singing folk songs. The audience was warm and appreciative, but Margaret could sense they were waiting for something more substantial. "Ladies and gentlemen," Linda's voice carried clearly from the stage, "we have a very special surprise for you this evening. 3 weeks ago, we thought we might have to cancel our featured performance due to a last-minute change. But sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places." Margaret's heart began racing even faster. This was it. Our featured performer tonight is someone many of you see every day at our community center, though you might not have realized her extraordinary background. Please welcome Margaret Chun, who will be performing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The applause was polite but puzzled. Margaret could imagine the audience members looking at each other, wondering who this Margaret Chun was and why they'd never heard of her before. Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed Margaret's shoulder. "You've got this. Just remember, play the music you love." Margaret walked onto the stage, her legs feeling unsteady. The stage lights were brighter than she remembered from her practicing sessions, and the audience seemed impossibly large from up here. She could see faces in the front rows, some curious, others skeptical. She sat down at the piano bench and adjusted her position, just as she'd done thousands of times before. But her hands were trembling so badly that she had to take a moment to steady them. The audience waited patiently, probably assuming she was just nervous about performing a difficult piece. Margaret placed her fingers on the keys and took a deep breath. For a moment, her mind went completely blank. She couldn't remember how the piece started. Panic began to rise in her chest. Then, somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard David's voice. It was something he used to tell her during the difficult years when she was caring for her parents and had given up performing. "The music is still there, sweetheart. It's always there, waiting for you to find it again." Margaret closed her eyes and let her hands find their way to the opening notes. The first few measures came out tentatively, and she could sense the audience's uncertainty. But as the familiar melody began to unfold, something magical started to happen. The years of doubt and fear began to melt away. Her hands remembered exactly what to do. The music that had been locked inside her for so long came pouring out, and with it, all the emotions she'd been holding back. This wasn't the same pianist who had performed this piece 20 years ago. That young woman had played with technical brilliance and youthful energy. This Margaret brought something deeper to the music. Every note carried the weight of experience, of loss and love and resilience. The playful passages sparkled with hard-won joy, while the dramatic sections thundered with the power of someone who had faced real storms and survived them. The audience fell completely silent. The skeptical expressions on the faces in the front row had been replaced by wonder. People who had come expecting a pleasant community event were witnessing something extraordinary. Margaret lost herself in the music completely. Her fingers danced through the complex passages with an ease that made them seem effortless. The lyrical themes sang with a beauty that brought tears to listeners' eyes. When she reached the powerful climax near the end of the piece, the entire audience seemed to hold its breath. As the final notes faded into silence, Margaret sat perfectly still for a moment, hardly believing what had just happened. She had done it. She had found her way back to the music that had once defined her life. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, someone in the back of the auditorium began to clap. Within seconds, the entire audience erupted into thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering with an enthusiasm that surprised even the organizers. Margaret stood up from the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. She could see tears on many faces in the audience. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying openly from the side of the stage. Even the normally composed board members looked stunned. The applause continued for several minutes. Margaret took a bow, then another, as the audience refused to quiet down. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" from the balcony. Others were wiping their eyes with tissues. Finally, Linda returned to the stage to restore order. "I think we can all agree that was absolutely magnificent," she said into the microphone. Margaret, would you mind sharing a few words with our audience? Margaret approached the microphone with trembling hands. She had not prepared for this moment. I want to thank you all for your kindness tonight, she began, her voice shaky with emotion. Music was my first love, though life led me down different paths for many years. I never imagined I would have the chance to share it with you like this. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. I also want to say that the music program here is something truly special. The teachers and students work incredibly hard, and they deserve all the support you can give them. Music has the power to change lives, and programs like this, one makes sure that power reaches the people who need it most. The audience applauded again, and Margaret returned to her seat in the wings to watch the rest of the program. But she knew that everything had changed. Word of her performance would spread quickly through the community and beyond Dodd as people began to leave after the program ended. Many stopped to speak with Margaret. Some were music lovers who recognized the level of artistry they had witnessed. Others were simply moved by the beauty of what they had heard. "Have you ever considered teaching?" asked Dr. Williams, the community center's board chairman. "We would be honored to have someone of your caliber join our staff." Mrs. Rodriguez overheard and jumped in excitedly. "Margaret, you could have your own studio here. Advanced students, maybe even a master class series for adult learners?" Margaret felt overwhelmed by the possibilities. A few hours ago, she had been the invisible custodian. Now, people were offering her a chance to return to the musical world she thought she had left forever. "I need some time to think about all this," she said honestly. "But thank you for the warm welcome back to music." As Margaret drove home that night, she realized that she was no longer the same person who had arrived at the community center 6 months ago. She had rediscovered not just her musical abilities, but a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. The next morning, Mrs. Rodriguez called her with exciting news. "Margaret, the fundraiser raised twice as much money as we expected. People are still talking about your performance. And I've had 3 calls already from people asking about piano lessons with you." Margaret smiled as she looked out her apartment window at the morning sun. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I think it's time we had a serious conversation about my future here." For the first time in 20 years, Margaret Chung was ready to be a musician again.